So we're back with the list. Today we're doing albums 70 through 61. I make these videos as a part of, the vinyl community on YouTube. There are several people that have made their own top 200 or top 100 lists, most of them 100 lists. And I'll, link some of those in the description below, some of those channels. But it also got me thinking about other channels that I watch. People, some of them that I even consider friends that I've made, since doing this and starting this channel and making these videos. And I reached out to some of them and asked them to make a short video of talking about their favorite albums. And yeah, I'm going to be including those in future installments of this series. In fact, actually, we're going to start today, and we're going to have the first one coming up now.
Right then, my 5 favourite albums of all time in 90 seconds. So, first up, Fleetwood Mac and Rumours. I know this is an obvious choice. I know that every man and his dog has this record, but that's because it's so bloody good. I first heard this probably about 1988. They're the first band that I ever saw live at the Tango in the Night tour. I was 12 years old, and yes, I've still got a crush on Stevie Nicks. Right, my first favourite band were Queen. This is their third album, and easily their best album, Sheer Heart Attack. This really shows what they were so good at. Brilliant overblown rock tunes like Brighton Rock and Now I'm Here, but you've also got those quirky little pop songs they were so good at, stuff like Bring Back That Leroy Brown and Killer Queen. Britpop was a really big thing for me in the early 90s, or so the mid 90s, and this I think is the best Britpop album. This is Blur and Part Life. Now, if you only know Damon Albarn for the Gorillaz, check this out. This is a perfect record from start to finish. 4 absolutely classic singles on here: Girls and Boys, End of a Century, Part Life, and To the End. But every song is wonderful. I could quite easily have put this at number 1. This is Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. Stevie had a perfect run of albums in the early 70s. I could have picked any one of those records, but I'm going with this because there's most to it. You got a double album and an additional EP as well. If you don't have it, buy it. And finally, my favourite album of all time is Sign of the Times by Prince. I'm over the 90 seconds, what the hell. Sign of the Times by Prince. I don't really need to say too much about this because I've waffled on about Prince enough recently, but there you go.
All right, so at 70, I have B1000, Guided by Voices from 1994. It was around the early 2000s. There was a young lady that I was kind of talking to at the time, as we say. And she made a mix CD for me. And of all of the songs on that mix that I'd never heard before, it was the song Game of Pricks by Guided by Voices that really struck a chord with me. I'd always read about Guided by Voices, but I just never really listened to their music. It led me to pick up Alien Lanes, and then eventually, just over the years, over the last 20 so years, I've just gradually picked up, more and more of their albums. Because I have the GBV box, I have every album in some format, vinyl or CD, except for one, maybe 2. All the way up until Half Smiles of the Decomposed. B1000 is just one that I've always returned to. It's one of their strongest albums. I think most people agree with that. I will admit, though, that with a lot of Guided by Voices albums, there's so many tracks that it's the hookier moments, or, just certain songs in particular, are just so much better than on the album than the sum of its parts. There are just so many great hooks on this album. Tractor Rape Chain is one of their best. Echo's Myron, I Am a Scientist, Smothered in Hugs. Even some songs that aren't straight ahead rockers like Gold Heart, Mountaintop, Queen Directory. It's a total earworm. It stays in my head every single time I hear it. But on B1000, even more so than some of their other albums, it's the song fragments that I still love. That they don't sound quite like fully fleshed out tunes. Songs like Kicker of Elves and You're Not an Airplane are still just enjoyable. But really what the best thing is about Guided by Voices are those songs, the short, like minute and a half, minute 45 songs that have those hooks that just leave you wanting more. Probably the best example of that is Buzzards and Dreadful Crows. Every single time I hear that song, I want it to be at least another minute and a half longer. It just hits you right in the face, and it's just such a great, great song.
Don't stop the robot boy. It's one thing, it's something to do. The robot boy, yeah. If I waited for lessons or two confessions, that would take all day here to stay. Don't stop the robot boy, but that's okay.
Number 69, I have Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space by Spiritualized from 1997. The first Spiritualized album that I ever heard was Let It Come Down. And they had a sound that I just had never really heard before, not in a lot of the other music that I listened to. Sure, it was indebted to classic rock, but it was that infusion of gospel and blues that had an elevated drama to it. But one night around that time that I had gotten into Let It Come Down, I was with some friends and I was talking about Spiritualized and how much I enjoyed that album. And a friend of mine asked me if I had ever heard this one. And I hadn't up to that point. And he said, that's the one that really knocks me back. He's like, that's the one that I think a lot of people consider like their classic. So eventually I went and picked up a CD of it. And yeah, right from the get-go, it just blew me away. It had a lot of the same elements that are on Let It Come Down, but it was just more intense. It was a more in-your-face album. There's a lot more noise, more dynamics. It almost made Let It Come Down seem tame in comparison. Both albums have a huge sound with huge arrangements. There's also something about this record, that section of Individual into Broken Heart, into No God Only Religion. And it's just the kind of ebb and flow of those three tracks back to back. How subtle Broken Heart is. It makes you kind of hear in the album as an entirety, something very personal. I mean, obviously there's that kind of maximalist production factor to it. So it's not really intimate, but it's heartfelt, you really hear that. I think it's definitely Jason Pierce's most personal kind of songwriting, at least for years. He would kind of get there again with songs in A&E. Yeah, but the inclusion of the London Gospel Community Choir and just, the other elements of horns and everything, it's the amount of chaos that kind of exists on this record at times. It takes you for an emotional ride. And I'm a sucker for that emotional kind of music. At number 68, I have Led Zeppelin 3 by Led Zeppelin from 1970. So, I mean, what hasn't been said about Zeppelin, and everybody knows their albums. I don't really need to talk about them too much. What I will say is, kind of my relationship with Zeppelin and like where it stands today. As a teen, I was huge into Led Zeppelin. I think a lot of people in their teens were just all about Led Zeppelin. But in more recent years, I think I just burned myself out on them, to be completely honest. And I'd say within the last 7 to 8 years, this is probably the only one that I ever really listened to as a full album anymore. It just has everything that you really need from Led Zeppelin on one album. It's got that kind of, hard rocks, sound, patented sound of theirs, that kind of the proto-metal of Immigrant Song, or, songs like Out on the Tiles or Celebration Day. And it even has, that blues rock and Since I've Been Loving You. But where this album really, they kind of, they progressed their sound a good amount with this album compared to the previous two. And I feel like this is where you really start to see the true strengths of Jimmy Page as a composer. It's those acoustic songs like Gallows Pole. Bronniauer Stomp is always been a favorite deep cut of mine. I just love the variety of this album. But if I was to ever say get rid of all of my Zeppelin records except for one, this is a no-brainer. Led Zeppelin 3 would be the one that I would keep. Number 67, I have Traffic by Traffic from 1968. One day, my dad was in the area where I went to school on business, and he asked me to meet him for dinner, and he had a friend of his with him, a coworker and friend. And my dad was doing that thing, that dads do. They're like, and he was like, John's been listening to a lot of music lately that you or I, would have listened to when we were younger. And his friend was like supposedly a big music guy. And so his friend just kind of like threw all these names of bands at me to kind of like test my knowledge or whatever. And I knew every single one, except he said, have you ever listened to Traffic? It's like a lot of people your age don't really know Traffic, and they don't get a lot of radio airplay. And so, yeah, he'd stumped me. And I hadn't really listened to Traffic at that point. So I just started at album 1, and I got Mr. Fantasy, and I thought it was good. I think I preferred more of the straight ahead rock numbers on it at that time. I've grown to love it as a whole, over the years. And then I got to this album, and this one just really, really grabbed me. Of course, Feeling All Right was on here, and I was already familiar with the Joe Cocker version. How the Beatles were so indebted to, early on in their career especially, to Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and then the Rolling Stones as they got into the later 60s, even went further in on blues, Traffic, and on this record, even though the first one too, you could really hear the influences of folk and jazz. I'd be remiss in not saying really that Steve Winwood is my favorite rock vocalist from this time period, from this era, the late 60s, early 70s. He's just my favorite. He has just so much soul in his voice. And you could just really hear, that influence from R&B and everything that he did. The tandem writing of him and Dave Mason is just so strong throughout this record, and their styles contrast each other perfectly. In fact, each member of this band and this lineup really brought their unique talents, to the table. Yeah, I was all in on Traffic for several years, and I still love the majority of their discography. I really do think, I think that they've gained more notoriety in recent years, possibly, maybe not. They might still kind of be overlooked, but I think they were one of the best bands from that era, hands down. At number 66, I have the Allman Brothers Band at Fillmore East by the Allman Brothers from 1971. So in my teen years, other than Led Zeppelin, the one band from the kind of classic rock era that I was really into was the Allman Brothers Band. I think, sure, being from the South, that might have had something to do with it. They got heavy play on classic rock stations, in the area in which I grew up in. I had mentioned before when I talked about the Black Crowes and Southern Harmony and Musical Companion, that it was that album that really introduced me to classic rock. You could hear the influences of Zeppelin and the Allman Brothers. And so it just led me straight to those two bands. And I think it was why I was just so obsessed with them as a teen, compared to really anything else like the Beatles or Pink Floyd or whatever. I still really like a lot of Allman Brothers studio albums. Idlewild South is a favorite, but I just feel like this is the one thing that I can always return to, and this is the one record that I can always listen to. And I love the expanded versions of it that have been released since, where you get more of the performance. But just what's on this album alone is plenty. Stormy Monday is just perfect. It's the kind of song that I would put on like late at night, and just chill to. And of course, just the extended version of Whipping Post, which already by itself, the studio version of that song is just amazing. And I don't know if Greg Allman could ever replicate, that vocal performance that they captured in the studio. But he does a serviceable job here. But it's just the extended jam of that song and just how they take it to the next level. Yeah, everybody should know this album. It's one of the greatest live albums ever. At number 65, I have Kind of Blue by Miles Davis from 1959. So yeah, like thousands of other people have said before, this was the first full jazz album that I had ever listened to. I used to listen to a local radio station, a community radio station, when I was in high school, like my senior year in high school. I was doing a lot of art, like late at night, and I would listen to that jazz radio station, just kind of have it on in the background. And then one of my really good friends in high school was studying music at kind of like a magnet school or something, you know, in our area, and his class was a jazz guitar class. But then one night, we used to have these late nights, these kind of late night sessions at Waffle House, where we would just sit and drink coffee and like smoke cigarettes and just talk all night long. And one night he kind of went into talking about Kind of Blue and how amazing Kind of Blue was, and he explained, you know, what made it so great, the amount of space that exists through it. And his lecture just inspired me to get the album itself and listen to it all the way through, to kind of get his perspective, you know, as a musician. It kind of helped guide me through it. But I still love it to this day. I'm as Captain Obvious of a pick as it might be to put on a favorite albums list. I just never get tired of it. And it's something that I can almost put on at any time. And I don't even need some fancy schmancy audio file pressing of it. At number 64, I have Mingus by Charles Mingus from 1959. So maybe a couple of years after really getting into Kind of Blue. And this was an album that I don't know, just read about and decided to check it out. And after Kind of Blue, this was the album kind of from that era that really grabbed me. When I listened to this record, I felt like I was in the room. I don't know if it's the way that it was recorded. I know that there are certain things that were left in and things that are picked up on the mic, like kind of like the whoops and hollers that you hear in Better Get It In Your Soul and Boogie Stop Shuffle. But I'd say probably the most important thing about this record to me at the time was, you know, reading through the liner notes, it really kind of like pointed me in directions of some of the other great jazz artists of that time, or that even came before. This is referenced in the song titles. Goodbye Pork Pie Hat is a nod to Lester Young, who was a huge influence on Charles Mingus. You know, there's Bird Calls, referencing Charlie Parker. There's a Letter to Duke, and then there's even like Jelly Roll. I haven't really explored all of those artists as fully as a lot of other jazz enthusiasts, but it at least pointed me in certain directions and at least provided an awareness. I love Charles Mingus. There's still a lot of his albums that I need to explore, but I have a good amount of them, and he's definitely one of my favorite jazz artists for sure. At number 63, I have Stand by Sly and the Family Stone from 1969. When I got to Sly and the Family Stone, it was around that same time that I mentioned earlier, when I was diving into like music from the past. And Sly and the Family Stone, they kind of bridged a gap from rock and roll and pop music, you know, to soul and funk. They just had a very kind of like all-inclusive sound. So yeah, There's a Riot Going On is an absolute masterpiece. If you're gonna have Sly and the Family Stone represented in your favorite albums list, yeah, There's a Riot Going On is the cooler pick, I guess. It even probably had, definitely had, you know, a more powerful statement to it. It spoke directly to the times, what was happening in 1971 and where our country was. There's a Riot Going On was a full-on response to that. But believe it or not, this sad bastard actually kind of prefers the more positive vibes of this record. Not that there isn't, you know, social commentary. Obviously, it still exists on this album, but there's more of a kind of like a hopeful message, or you know, it's that message of kind of like inclusion, you know, and empowerment. I just love the hooks on this record, the arrangements, The vocal arrangements, the harmonizing is just perfect. The musicianship is spot on, and Sly's the man. At 62, I have Hi-Hat by Six String Drag from 1997. So I went to college in the same area where I live now, even though it was just over the border in South Carolina. And this band was just starting to kind of break up right around the time when I was in college. But I had never heard them. I was completely unaware of them. And I find that shocking to this day, actually, because of how much I was into this music, this kind of like alt country sound. Thought that I would have stumbled upon this record, and I just didn't. But in the last, 8 to 10 years, I've been a little bit more interested in learning about the music scene of North Carolina, and that's when I came across this record. And as soon as I heard it, I was like, fuck, where has this been all my life? It's just a fantastic alt country record. I think it's one of the best alt country records ever. It's definitely one of the best from the 90s. It starts with Kenny Roby, who's an excellent songwriter. That's actually who I learned about first. I learned about Kenny Roby first through some of his solo records. He's one of the more underrated songwriters, still to this day, does not get the amount of acclaim that he deserves. A lot of these songs are story songs, and they don't even have to be like long drawn out ballads. I mean, they're 3.5 minute tunes, but they're full on narratives. Kenny Roby almost has kind of two voices. He's got this on a lot of songs. It's very kind of straight country, honky tonk sounding kind of like vocals. And then on other songs, he's got almost this he sounds almost like a Southern Elvis Costello. He kind of has that snarky kind of croon that Elvis Costello has. You get a little bit of everything. You get kind of some of the more straight ahead folk. You get that, classic patented kind of, distorted guitar, alt country, and then on some songs you even get stacked horns. It's just an excellent record. I know some people that are familiar with it, but not enough people are. So I highly recommend it, especially if you're into alt country and Americana. This is definitely an album that you shouldn't sleep on.
Oh, Red, where you going? Oh, Red, what you doing? Does your mama know you're just like her? Does she know how much you try to be and how much you try not to be? Oh, Jesus got his hands in you. So let's talk about the water and just how much you need and just how much he can spare. Please tell me you didn't forget to care.
At number 61, I have Doolittle by the Pixies from 1989. I didn't get into the Pixies until later. They were never a band that I really listened to in high school. I was familiar with Here Comes My Man because it would sometimes still sneak in on alternative radio playlists. Here Comes Your Man is never a song that should introduce you to this band because it sounds like nothing else that they had done up to that point. It sounds like nothing else on this record. College roommate of mine was really into the Pixies, and so I borrowed Surfer Rosa from him, and I absolutely loved it. The sheer violence on that record is amazing. Crescendo is still the big driving thing to their sound, on a song like Hey. But you also get, that same kind of gnarly kind of sound on songs like Gouge Away. And then, of course, Debaser, which is one of the best side one, track ones ever. It's just an incredible opener. And then to follow that up with Tame and just that demonic kind of howl that he had. That sounds like a horror film captured in 2 minutes. It's just, that song is incredible. On Wave of Mutilation, you get a little bit of a taste of what you're gonna hear on Bossa Nova, and then getting back to like, Here Comes Your Man, it's such a great little pop gem, but it doesn't necessarily stick out like a sore thumb. It doesn't sound like anything else on the record, but it's kind of balanced out by these other moments, of fresher sound for them compared to Surfer Rosa. Like La La Means I Love You, it completely comes out of left field. And then Monkey Gone to Heaven has just an expert production quality to it. It really might be their best recorded moment. Gil Norton just brought something to the table as a producer. It's like he took what the band was and the sound that they had on Surfer Rosa, and he just refined it. He kind of cleaned it up a little bit, but it still sounds very raw, and they still just sound very much like the Pixies. All right, so that's it for this one. Again, going to try and be back sooner with the next one. Would love, no, I'm not even going to put a date on it. I'm not even going to put a date on it at this point. Anyway, hope everybody's doing well. All right, see you in the next one.
Digital gramophone makes no sense.